HP Lion Pride PT 11. Tracy and Daphne had just finished their last class for the day, and were on their way to meet Harry and the others for dinner. They were deep in a discussion regarding their charms lesson and didn't notice the group of girls that were standing in front of them, blocking the hallway. Both Slytherins looked up just before they ran into the lead girl, who was glaring at them as if they were something quite foul. There were 8 girls in total, some from Gryffindor, Ravenclaw, and Hufflepuff houses. The girl in the middle, who appeared to be in charge, Daphne recognized at once as Romilda Vane. Shortly after Christmas holiday ended, Hermione, along with Ginny Weasley, had pointed this girl out, and informed Daphne that there was a growing contingent of Hogwarts girls, led by Romilda, who believed that the Slytherin girl had Harry in her clutches quite long enough. Both Ginny and Hermione warned her that they had heard rumor that Harry might be slipped a love potion just to get Daphne and Harry to split up and give other girls a chance at the Gryffindor Golden Boy. Daphne had found the whole thing ridiculous, and laughed it all off, though inwardly, she had put her guard up, and tried to monitor who Harry interacted with, just in case. Harry had of course heard the same warnings, and much to Daphne's relief, seemed to be trying to take precautions. Harry had taken to using revealing spells of his food and drinks, just to be safe. Neville had even joked about getting him a hip flask, much like Mad-Eye Moody had. Daphne had also started noticing an alarming amount of girls giving her death glares. Most of these she ignored, but there were a handful of girls, mostly 7th years, she made mental notes to beware of. Some of those girls were quite powerful, and more than a bit scary in their own ways. Romilda was quite tall and mature looking for a 4th year, with long curly black hair and piercing hazel eyes. She was in fact, quite pretty, if not for her rather snobbish demeanor. She stood with her arms crossed over her ample chest, staring daggers at Daphne, who looked a bit surprised. Tracy on the other hand looked to be sizing them all up. "We've come to give you proper warning. It's time you let Harry go. You've had your fun, and he deserves something better." "Excuse me?" Daphne asked with shock. "Had my fun? What exactly do you think I'm doing to him?" "Oh come on. There's no way that Harry would willing fall for a Slytherin. We all know that you've enchanted him. He never looks happy. I'd watch your tongue before someone rips it out of your head," Tracy warned. "You don't know the first thing about him. I know he always looks miserable in our common room. I know that he takes extra lessons so he doesn't have to spend time with her." Romilda nodded toward Daphne, who was getting more than a little irritated. Tracy could swear that she felt the air ripple next to her. "We think that you should do what's right for him, and let him go. Give him a chance to find real happiness. He deserves the best, and you're most definitely not it." This came from a girl standing next to Romilda, who was wearing Ravenclaw robes. "Have any of you even thought of the possibility he looks miserable because we aren't in the same house and can't spend as much time together as we'd like?" Daphne asked, eyeing each girl in turn and settling her gaze on Vane, who simply scoffed at the suggestion. "Right. Like he's really that hung up on you? Please. There are literally a dozen really good-looking witches in Gryffindor who would shag him rotten if they weren't afraid of what you and your snake friends might do to them. But I'm not afraid, and I'm just giving you notice that I'm going to make him mine by the end of the year. I'm going to wake him up from his terrible nightmare of dating you." "Is that so? Once he's free of whatever spells you've used on him, he'll be so grateful, it won't even be a question of what he'll do." Vane smiled, folding her arms over her ample chest. Daphne closed her eyes and took several breaths to try and calm herself down. When she opened her eyes again, she looked directly at Romilda, who looked as if she was smelling something very unpleasant. "I'm going to say this only once, so you'd better listen, you complete cow. Harry is free to do as he pleases. If he wishes to break up with me and see other people, he is free to do so. I have no more control over him than I do the weather. If I were using anything to bewitch him into staying with me, I think someone like Dumbledore might have noticed, and put a stop to it long ago. Tracy nodded for effect, glaring at each other girls who were standing in front of them in turn. Romilda just shook her head, snorting with disbelief. I'm supposed to believe a Slytherin couldn't find a way to fool teachers. Please. Frankly, I don't give a acromantulas arse what you believe, you slag. Daphne snapped, her anger getting the better of her. Harry is with me because he chooses to be. If you can't deal with that, then it's your problem. But let me be clear, if you try to do anything to ruin my relationship with my boyfriend, I will use all of my Slytherin guile, and make it my life's pursuit to destroy your life forever. And just so you know, I'm pretty tight with the Weasley twins. Now excuse me. Daphne pushed past Romilda, shoving her hard with her shoulder, with Tracy right behind her. They rounded a corner and made it down one flight of steps before Daphne's tears came. Tracy wrapped a comforting arm around her friend and guided her into an empty classroom. Wasn't real until now, was it? Tracy asked when the door closed. I don't doubt Harry at all, and I know he loves me, I do. But those cows could do something to him, and... Daph, listen to me. No one, especially Harry, is going to let anything come between you two. Harry still flinches whenever anyone mentions his moment of idiocy last summer. Daphne laughed lightly in spite of her anger and frustration. No one who matters thinks that what you two have is anything short of true love. Sirius told me during the summer that he could not have picked anyone better for Harry than you. You're smart, funny, powerful, not to mention one of the sexiest witches in the school next to me. Again Daphne laughed. She wiped at her eyes and thanked her friend for her support. Besides, I have the perfect solution for all this rubbish. Tracy grinned. What's that? Hexing that vain slag into eternity? Daphne asked, sniffing and wiping at her eyes again. Close. I was going to mention it to Astoria. Tracy winked. Oh come on, I know they're horrible people, but even they don't deserve that. Daphne said quickly, then she cocked her head, thinking about it for a moment. Well, okay, maybe vain. The two Slytherin girls fell into a fit of giggles and soon left the classroom. Harry noticed Daphne's puffy eyes when she and Tracy showed up for dinner. However, when he asked her what had upset her, she shook her head and told him it was nothing. Harry knew it was best not to push, and that she would tell him when she felt better. Through dinner, he noticed Romilda Vane shooting his girlfriend death glares. This was becoming commonplace with many girls around the school and it was starting to irritate him. He hadn't noticed it before Ginny had told him about overhearing some girls discussing plans to slip him a love potion. Since then, he couldn't help but see the glares that Daphne got. Most of the time Daphne ignored it, but Harry guessed today something else had happened to get her upset. Harry decided it needed to stop once and for all, and that everyone needed to just deal with the fact that he was with Daphne, and that wasn't likely to change so long as he had any say in the matter. Hey! He said, turning to look at her. She looked up, her dark eyes still a bit red from crying, he guessed. He leaned in and captured her lips and held them with his own for a long moment. What was that for? She asked, a little confused, as Harry was sometimes reticent about being affectionate in the middle of the Great Hall. Because I love you. He smiled simply, and returned to eating. Daphne couldn't help but smile, and gave him a playful nudge with her shoulder in return. Her mood lightened considerably throughout the rest of dinner and into their study session. Harry noticed that Daphne did tend to keep some sort of physical contact with him, whether it be sitting very close, or nudging him playfully. She only tensed up again when Romilda Vane and her group of friends came into the library to study. Harry felt Daphne stiffen a bit next to him, but once he kissed her again and rubbed the back of her neck, she relaxed a bit. Harry didn't fail to notice that Daphne had gotten tense when Romilda entered, and when the same girl was staring at her during dinner. He remembered Ginny's warning, and felt things were starting to get out of hand. He had way too much to worry about, and didn't need a bunch of stupid fangirls making life difficult for people he counted on. Harry was going to have a word or two with Vane and make it clear where his heart was, and that she needed to get over her crush or whatever she thought she felt for him. He had made no progress since returning to the school. The remaining wards had remained in place, and his growing desperation was making it so much harder to repair that blasted cabinet. Draco Malfoy paced in front of the object of his ire, ruffling his normally sleek hair, and cursing loudly at his own ineptitude. Every time he felt he was getting close, he would lose concentration, or be too drained to accomplish anything. He was barely sleeping, and rarely ate, and he had become sickly looking. Drawn and pale. A shadow of himself. What was worse was his growing paranoia. He felt as if he were being watched everywhere he went. He didn't even trust Crabbe, Goyle, or Not any longer. He'd started avoiding them all, leaving the dorm before they awoke in the morning, and returning late in the night. So far, he'd been lucky he hadn't been caught by Filch or that insufferable cat. He had been attending classes, though he barely paid any attention, and rarely finished class work. Snape had tried again on several occasions to gain his confidence, but Draco always refused to listen, and always managed to escape the greasy man's clutches. Draco sat down in a huff, staring at the broken cabinet, and wishing for the millionth time that he had never begged to be marked. He knew now without question that he was in over his head, and all he wanted to do was to run. To take his mother and escape to France, or Germany, or Russia. Far from England and the ire of the Dark Lord. He had only heard from his mother once in the nearly 2 months he'd been back at school. She had him a short letter along with some cookies, which he'd scarfed down with relish. The letter had hinted that it would be wise to seek help. The trouble was, she had not indicated from where he should seek such help, or what kind of help. Whenever he thought of her advice, he became infuriated by it. Now was not the time for cryptic riddles. His first thought was to accept Snape's help. However, the words of many disgruntled Death Eaters always gave him pause. Snape was highly suspect. Many felt he was too close to their master. Others felt he was too close to Dumbledore to be trusted. Draco's own thoughts of the man were that he would gladly sacrifice anyone to get in the good graces of the Dark Lord. Despite the fact that he had been a family friend for many years, Draco just didn't feel that Snape was the help his mother had referred to. It really only left Dumbledore. The man he was supposed to kill. But that would mean admitting what he'd done, and what he was supposed to do, and Draco knew that meant a one-way ticket to Azkaban, and that thought chilled Draco to the bone. He had no other recourse but to complete his task. It was the only way to save his own life as well as his mother's. He had been spending a lot of time planning his escape from England once he'd accomplished his task. He'd also spent an immeasurable amount of time researching the Dark Mark and any way he might break its charm so that once he fled with his mother, the Dark Lord would be unable to track them down. He had been unable to convince any teachers to allow him into the restricted section of the library, especially since he was avoiding any interaction with Snape. Draco was sure that several answers to his problems were hidden within those ancient tomes. He felt stupid for not thinking of these things while he was at home, as the Malfoy library was a fountain of information on all things dark. There was nothing for it now. He had to break the remaining wards and repair the vanishing cabinet, and he had to find a way to kill Albus Dumbledore, and he had to do it quickly. He could feel the cold breath of death on him more and more with each passing day. Professor Snape. Snape looked up at the door where the near mirror image of his school rival stood, looking tentative. Snape waved his hand nonchalantly, beckoning the young man into his classroom. Harry Potter entered upon the professor's signal, and shut the door behind him. "Today will be our final lesson," Snape said, not even bothering to look up. "I have given you a very thorough education in dark magic spells. You have, rather surprisingly, managed to master many of those spells." Harry smirked at Snape's version of a compliment. Snape rose from his desk and approached Harry, staring hard into his green eyes. He brought up his wand and aimed it over Harry's shoulder. Harry heard the distinct squelching sound of the door being sealed magically. "The last spell I have for you is a very dark spell. It will open a very deep cut in your opponent's flesh. Without the counter curse, your enemy will bleed out and die. The incantation is Sectum Sempra." Snape stepped to Harry's side, and with a flick of his wand, a practice dummy, similar to those that I used during their meetings, appeared out of a cabinet behind his desk. "This is not a terribly complicated spell, so there is no reason why you should not master it at the end of our lesson. However, please refrain from teaching it to any of your friends. This is not a spell that is known by the Death Eaters, save for one." "Me? You?" Harry asked, looking at his defense teacher. "I have never taught it to anyone. I only do so now at the headmaster's request to give you any advantages I can. Now, watch carefully." Snape demonstrated the wand movement for the spell. Harry watched Snape's demonstration, and then tried it for himself. Snape snapped his wand on the back of Harry's hand when he did it wrong. Harry tried a few more times with similar results before Snape felt it was good enough to attempt a real spell. Harry took aim and cleared his throat. The spell shot across the room, hitting the dummy directly in the chest, leaving a slightly charred slash across the torso. Harry went quickly over to inspect the damage he'd inflicted, and imagined what it might do to a living, breathing person. The slash mark was thin, but was quite long. Harry had caught the dummy below the chin, and the charred slash ended near the navel area. Harry turned back to Snape, who was watching him contemptuously. "Where did you learn this spell?" Harry asked. "I invented it," Snape said, folding his arms superiorly. Harry stared at his defense teacher with a mixture of awe and loathing. Harry guessed that Snape had developed his spell to use against Muggles and Voldemort's enemies. "Have you ever used it against anyone?" Harry asked, staring coldly at Snape, who still looked smug. "Yes. Of course I have." And then Harry saw it. Only for a second, but he knew he wasn't mistaken. Snape's cold black eyes softened for a split second, and looked regretful, before returning to their normal cold indifference. "How many?" Harry pressed, returning to Snape's side to attempt the spell again. "What does it matter?" "It just does," Harry said firmly as he fired the new spell again, hitting the dummy with a diagonal cut from shoulder to hip. 7. Snape said after a long pause in which Harry had hit the dummy 3 more times. "Who were they?" Snape looked at Harry, raising an eyebrow. "Why is it any of your business, Potter? Last time I checked, you are in no position to pass judgment upon me. I have paid for my crimes, not that it is any of your concern. All you need to worry about is mastering this spell so that we can finally stop having these visits." Harry agreed that he wanted to end his training with Snape. It always left him feeling disgusting and dirty. Usually after a lesson with Snape, he would spend an hour in the shower, trying to feel normal and clean again. Plus, the sooner he finished with this final lesson, he would be able to meet up with Daphne, and maybe get some time in the room of requirement. She had been hinting that Tracy had given her an idea that she really wanted to try on Harry. She had mentioned that she had been practicing using a banana. Again. Snape commanded, snapping Harry out of his very pleasurable thoughts. Harry practiced for another 3 hours, in which Snape, as he had on every other lesson before this, had made him perform non-verbally once he felt Harry had the spell down well enough. By the end, when Snape had apparently had enough of Harry, and Harry felt he could perform this new spell just as well as the rest of his magical arsenal, Harry actually felt very tired. He was thankful that this was supposed to be his last lesson with the greasy-haired git, but something occurred to him as he was heading back to Gryffindor Tower to change and shower. Snape had not once insulted him or his father. Harry could not remember any lesson in which Snape had not at some point told Harry he was no better than his vile father. But today, not a syllable on the subject. Plus there was that brief second of what Harry could only describe as regret. It really struck Harry, because, so far as he had guessed, Snape was an emotionless sack of putridness. The new spell he'd shown Harry that day was proof of it, really. Who would bother inventing a spell that would basically kill your enemy slowly? Harry shuddered as he thought of using the deadly spell. He thought back to the previous summer when he'd talked to Sirius about what he might have to do in the war. Moody had worked them pretty hard that day, and Tonks had shown them some pretty powerful spells. "What's up, kid? You look like you might be sick," Sirius had said upon finding Harry staring out his window when he should have been sleeping. "I don't know if I can do it, Sirius. Take someone's life again. I mean, when I thought Daphne had been killed, and I blasted that Death Eater, I was so full of adrenaline, I couldn't think straight. Harry, I just don't think it's in you to kill someone in cold blood." Sirius smiled, sitting on Harry's bed. "You might find yourself in situations where the only way to survive will be to kill your enemy. Remember that they won't hesitate to kill you. Or, well, I guess you'll be safe until they bring you before Voldemort, since he wants to kill you, but you get my point, right?" Harry gave a small nod and smiled. "The point is that you'll be acting in self-defense, and defense of your friends. You'll do what needs to be done. If you didn't feel remorse or a bit of guilt, then I'd worry. You're a really good man, Harry, who's got one hell of a job to do before him. What's important is that you stick to what you believe and remember what it is you're fighting for." Sirius gave a devious grin and nodded towards the door. "And when you finally do ask that incredibly gorgeous woman to marry you, I want to be your best man." Harry sighed as he gave the password and passed through the portrait hole. The common room was fairly empty as Hufflepuff was playing Slytherin that day. Harry wondered idly if he could get a shower and catch the end of the game. Heading up into the dorm, he opened his trunk to grab some fresh clothes when he noticed something. Shifting a few items around, he saw that the Marauders map was missing. Thinking that it might be in his book bag, he dumped that out onto his bed and began sorting through his things. There was no sign of it. He remembered putting it back into his trunk when he'd gotten back to the dorm last night. He and Daphne had been using it to try and figure out where Draco had been disappearing to. He had put it in his trunk next to the two-way mirror he used to talk to Sirius, and that was still there. Harry wondered if Hermione had taken it, but couldn't for the life of him figure out why she would use it. It was possible that Neville might have it, but it was likely he was with Hermione at the game, and neither Tracy or Daphne could get into the Gryffindor Tower. So where the hell could it be? He needed to find his friends, and try and figure out what had happened to the Marauders map. It was one of the few things he had that belonged to his father, and one of his most prized possessions. Not to mention its usefulness. Harry couldn't stand the thought of someone else taking the map. He had to find it. Theodore Nott sat on his bed in the 6th-year Slytherin dorm studying his newest acquisition. He couldn't stop congratulating himself for pulling off such a feat as he had that morning. It had taken a month's worth of planning, but he'd done it, and no one would ever suspect him. Everything started that night. He'd overheard Potter and Greengrass talking about the map. He had been awed to learn that Potter had a map of Hogwarts. He'd started tailing Potter, trying to get a glimpse of this legendary map. Unfortunately, he could never get close enough to see the damned thing. Then a month ago, while he was in the library, he'd seen it, and he'd seen how it worked. He couldn't believe his good luck. He hadn't been able to see the map to clear, and had to look as if he were searching for a book, but his plan had begun to form already. Draco had unintentionally provided the polyjuice potion, and that idiot first-year Gryffindor provided the necessary hair. What took the longest was finding the Gryffindor Tower, and learning the damned password. Fortunately, he had learned how to disillusion himself over the Christmas holiday, and had been using it in the castle for the last 2 months. Finally, the opportunity had presented itself that morning, with the whole school out watching Slytherin crushing Hufflepuff. He used the hairs of the Gryffindor first year and gained access to the atrocious Gryffindor common room. He remembered Draco's attempt at searching Greengrass drunk, and vowed not to repeat those mistakes. Fortunately for Nott, no one disturbed him while searching, and the map had been right on top of everything in Potter's trunk. He then returned to Slytherin House under a disillusionment charm to wait out the polyjuice potion and examine the map. He had not forgotten the words it took to make the map work, and was truly shocked to see that not only was it a nearly complete map of the school, but that it showed exactly where every single person was. He took great pleasure in watching Potter leave Snape's office and walk all the way back to his dorm. He noticed that Potter remained stationary for a little while, and Nott guessed he probably knew his map was gone. With luck, he'd think Draco had done it. Nott stopped watching Potter and began to really examine the map in earnest. He saw a handful of hidden corridors that led out of the castle, that he would need to check out. His master was going to be most pleased. Nott closed his eyes and sighed at the thought of what rewards awaited him for serving his dark master so well. Nott surreptitiously rubbed his left arm as he allowed his mind to wander. Harry Potter lay in his bed staring at the ceiling of his rather small bedroom. He'd been doing this ever since he'd returned to number 4, Privet Drive, the day of his best friend's funeral. The day he'd left the girl he loved, and his friends. Now, he was more miserable than he'd ever been in his entire existence, which was saying something. Harry lived with his aunt, uncle, and cousin, who had treated Harry as if he were some kind of disease. They had lied to the entire neighborhood, and perpetrated the rumors that he was some sort of delinquent. All because they hated anything they perceived to be abnormal. Growing up, Harry's relatives had done all they could to squash the freakishness out of him. They had made him their personal slave, never bought him anything new, or even celebrated his birthday. He'd grown up quite lonely, as his cousin, Dudley, had done everything in his power to ensure Harry was alone. Harry's life had changed forever the day he'd learned he was a wizard, and many hidden truths had come out on that fateful night. Over the next 5 years, Harry learned much about himself and his mysterious past. He'd even made friends. Hagrid had been the first. A monstrous mountain of a man, with the temperament of a cuddly teddy bear. Then Ron, on the train to school. Hermione followed, and for the next few years, they were inseparable. Until the tournament. The Triwizard Tournament had not only tested Harry's limits, but his friendships as well. Hermione had stuck by him from the beginning, but Ron, who suffered serious self-esteem issues, had not believed Harry. What was worse was that Ron had known all along that Harry had not entered himself, but his stubbornness, and his pride, wouldn't allow him to make things right between them. Eventually, Ron had apologized, and the three were once again united. Then, at the end of that year, a new friend revealed themselves, though it wasn't until the start of Harry's fifth and latest year that he would truly get to know Daphne. Daphne had proven to be so much more than another ally, or trusted confidant. She had awakened something within Harry's heart. She had become the single most important person in Harry's life, and he had been completely unaware of how much he truly cared for the girl until the day he watched her get cursed by a Death Eater. The moment she fell to the floor, presumably dead, Harry's world ceased. Daphne had survived, and so far as he knew, was mending well. It was because of that event, and what he learned after that night, that Harry felt it was better for everyone if they were to stay away from him. Harry had finally learned why it was he'd been hunted by the most powerful and notorious dark wizard in a century. Lord Voldemort wanted Harry dead because of a prophecy that predicted Voldemort's downfall. The funny thing was, that the prophecy was not specific. It could have been another Dark Lord, some other child. But it had been Voldemort to actually put the prophecy into effect. The Dark Lord had marked Harry as an equal the night he tried to murder Harry as an infant. That night, nearly 15 years ago, had irrevocably changed the fate of two wizards. Dumbledore had sworn that he was going to waste no more time, and train Harry to face his destiny. Harry had then vowed to protect the people he cared for. He would not see anyone else sacrifice themselves to save him. So, he had done the right thing, and told Daphne they could no longer see each other. Harry had never hated himself more than he did now. He knew that she was safe now that he was no longer in her life, but he could not stop thinking of her. He still had 2 more years at Hogwarts, and he would see her every day, and every day it would be a knife twisting in his heart. It wasn't just Daphne, though. He had vowed to keep away from Hermione and Neville and Tracy as well. He couldn't stand the thought of any one of them being used to get to him. He had proven that he would try to save those he cared for, and Harry knew the Dark Lord would exploit this weakness. Both Neville and Hermione had been writing to him. He'd gotten 2 letters from Neville, and at least one for every day he'd been back at the Dursleys from Hermione. Hermione was not going to give up, Harry knew, which was going to make things very difficult when school began. Harry hoped he might be kept very busy with his promised training. There was a soft knock on his door, and Harry's aunt poked her rather horse-like face into his bedroom. "Harry, lunch is nearly ready." "Thank you," Harry said politely, not moving from his bed. He heard the door close and sighed heavily. This had been the nicest his relatives had ever treated him, and Harry had Dumbledore to thank for it. The day that the headmaster brought Harry back to the Dursleys, he had insisted on speaking with Harry's Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia. Dumbledore glared at Harry's relatives, and spoke in a very disapproving tone the entire time. "Petunia, your sister would be most disappointed in how you have treated her son. You alone are responsible for all that has befallen Harry under your care. It is quite a miracle that Harry turned out better than your own son, for all the abuse he has had heaped upon him. To you, Vernon, who judge a person's worth by what they possess, this should be a lesson for you. Your nephew, whom you have spent a lifetime abusing, insulting, and using as a slave, is one of the richest people in England. As the last of the Potter line, he stands to gain a healthy sum of gold, as well as a handful of properties, and 2 or 3 very profitable businesses. Had you shown him kindness and love while he lived here, it is very likely he would have been most generous in return, once he learned of his vast fortune. Both Harry and Vernon had stared bug-eyed at Dumbledore. The old man simply shook his head in annoyance at the look of greed on Vernon and Petunia's faces. Even Dudley looked anxious to get his hands on a large pile of gold. "You can wipe those silly looks off your faces. I would not be surprised if Harry chose to use that wealth to see you all live the rest of your lives in total misery," the old man said bitterly. "Harry will be staying with you for 2 weeks. At that time, I will be coming to collect him, and then you will never see him again, unless he chooses to seek you out. Good evening." Dumbledore had held their gazes for a long moment, before taking Harry by the arm and walking to the door. "Sir, is all that true? Am I really that rich?" Harry had asked, more than a bit stunned. "It is indeed. The vault in which you've taken money out to purchase school items is little more than a trust vault. Many old families set them up with each child's birth, to make sure they can cover the costs of schooling. The Potter family was quite old, and had amassed quite a fortune. On your 17th birthday, you shall inherit it all, and the goblins will be most anxious to speak to you on matters of investment, I am sure. For now, however, you should not think on it. As I said, I will be coming to retrieve you in 2 weeks' time." "Where will we be going?" Harry asked. "I shall not say any more. Suffice to say, I believe that while we will be working very hard, you shall quite enjoy the holiday. Now, before I depart, there is one more matter in which I wish to speak on." "Your friends?" "No," Harry said, lowering his eyes. "It's better this way. I ask that you spend the next 2 weeks to reconsider, Harry. You do not have to do this alone. In fact, you might find that your friends will be able to help you in ways that you can not even begin to imagine. I won't watch another one of them die to protect me." Harry shook his head. "They're all better off staying away from me. It's safer for them that way." Dumbledore lowered his own head, and gave a soft sigh. "I hope you think about what I have said, Harry. I shall see you in 2 weeks' time." With that, the old headmaster left number 4 Privet Drive. Since that night, Harry's relatives had become some of the most cheerful, friendly people Harry had ever known. They couldn't seem to do enough for Harry. At meals, which Harry no longer was forced to cook, Aunt Petunia gave him the biggest helpings. Neither Uncle Vernon nor Dudley complained about this. Dudley was forced to do the chores usually set for Harry, and Vernon had not uttered the word freak at all. Unfortunately, Harry was onto their plan. They clearly thought that Harry would reward them for their treatment of him this summer. Harry always chuckled when he thought about it. There was no way 2 weeks of fawning would ever make up for 14 years of abuse and neglect. Harry brushed it all out of his mind. He had too much to concern himself with. He was trying to figure a way to avoid his friends at school this coming year, as well as wondering what he might be learning from Dumbledore that summer. However, as happens so often, his thoughts wandered to Daphne, and how she was doing. Dumbledore's words haunted him as well. "You might find that your friends will be able to help you in ways that you can not even begin to imagine." What did that even mean? Harry wondered. Are they going to jump in front of a killing curse? He cringed at the thought of Hermione lying upon the ground, her soft cinnamon-colored eyes staring lifeless up at him. Or Tracy's ever-present slight smirk frozen on her face forever. Or Neville, looking horrified as death took him. And Daphne. Stop it! Harry cursed himself. In the past few days, Harry's inner voice had begun sounding like Ron. The problem was, the Ron/inner voice was making sense. Harry thought somehow his psyche was taking on the properties of his friends in order to win this ongoing inner struggle. It's better for them, Harry argued. Is it? Ron would ask. Harry just imagined Ron standing before him, hands on his hips the way Hermione would stand when she was angry. Yes. Voldemort won't go after them if they don't associate with me. They're safer this way, dot. You're so daft, Potter. It doesn't matter if they're with you or not. He's seen your mind. He knows your heart. At least with you, they have a chance. And don't you deserve some happiness? Isn't better to have loved and lost? They deserve better. Harry argued with his subconscious, which now sounded exactly like his red-headed friend, which made Harry shudder to realize. So do you, mate. Harry heard the doorbell ring, and he leapt off his bed, thankful to end this madness. Today was the day that Dumbledore had said he would be coming to collect him. Harry had spent the last few days going through his meager belongings and preparing to leave the Dursleys for the last time. He shut the lid on his trunk and looked to see that Hedwig, his snowy owl, was still in her cage where she had been since arriving with another letter from Hermione that morning. He shut the cage, and trying not to disturb his owl, set her cage on top of his trunk, then went down to meet the headmaster, anxious to begin the next chapter of his life. It was not at all what she had expected. In fact, she found it rather disturbing. Every single house looked exactly alike, save for the numbers set beside each door. How could anyone live in such a place, she wondered as she walked down the quaint little street. Daphne had gotten her information just after breakfast. Her father had made a special flu call and given her what she needed. Her mother gave her a small coin purse which was filled with money, and waited with her as Daphne summoned the night bus. Daphne had decided quickly that she did not like the night bus. It was like riding the carts at Gringotts, which she had never truly liked. Once the bus finally stopped in Surrey, Daphne had gratefully stepped off, not relishing the thought of riding it home. However, since his house was not connected to the Flo network, she had very little choice. All of her concerns were washed away when she spotted number 4. Her feelings became mixed. She desperately wanted to see Harry and kiss him and hold onto him and tell him that there was nothing they couldn't overcome together. But he had tried to dump her. He had tried to break up with her for the stupidest reason she had ever heard in her life. He wanted to protect her. He wanted her to be safe from the war that he seemed to be at the center of. Like it was even remotely possible for her to be safe. The only way that could happen was if she were to leave England entirely, and that was not likely to happen. Not while he was here. They were destined to be together, and Daphne meant to make him see it, even if it killed him. The lawn was immaculate, and the stone walk looked as if it were scrubbed. Daphne almost felt as if she should have wiped her feet before stepping onto it. She felt like someone was watching her as she got to the door, though it was clear there was no one around. She rang the doorbell, and waited. She had spent a lot of time preparing herself for this meeting. She wanted Harry Potter to realize exactly how big a mistake he had made in trying to leave her. She had chosen her best pair of jeans, which she felt hugged her nicely, accentuating her curves. She matched that with a button-down shirt and vest, which made her chest look bigger, undoubtedly due to the bar she had worn. She had even left a few buttons undone to show off her cleavage. She was playing dirty, she knew, but all was fair in love and war. Her hair was loose around her face, just the way he liked. Harry had a strange fascination with her hair, not that she minded. It was incredibly nice the way he ran his fingers through her hair when they relaxed together. One time, she had sworn she'd started purring in her chest like some contented cat. Luckily, Harry had not heard a thing. She stood waiting for only a moment before the door opened and she set eyes on possibly the largest human being she had ever seen in her life. He was tall, taller than she was. But he was also immensely wide. Daphne could see that it wasn't all fat, however. His arms looked like they had more than a bit of muscle on them. He had sandy blonde hair and beady little eyes which roved over her body hungrily. It made her shiver slightly. "Can I help you?" the boy leered, and Daphne took an involuntary step back. "I'm here to see Harry Potter," Daphne said, sounding braver than she felt under this boy's lustful stare. At the mention of Harry's name, the boy's face changed to one of apprehension. "What do you want him for?" the boy asked, obviously curious why a girl would choose Harry over him. Daphne felt the sudden need to explain the finer points of women to this lunkhead, but she had more important things to deal with. "I need to speak with him." "Is he here?" Daphne said firmly, but politely. "Yeah," the boy said, his eyes darting about. Daphne wondered what he was looking for, as he seemed to be taking in the street beyond her, which was empty. "Are you one of them?" he asked, his tone becoming a bit fearful. "One of who?" Daphne asked curiously. The boy bent forward, and whispered, "His kind." Daphne was now horribly confused, and she was beginning to get angry. Well, angrier than she already was. "Could you just please get Harry?" she snapped. She had no time for this. "Who is it, Dudley, dear?" It was a woman, likely the boy's mother. Daphne was once again surprised when the woman appeared in the doorway. She was terribly thin with an impossibly long neck, and a face that only a horse could love. How had this woman made such a child? There was no resemblance at all. Perhaps the kid wasn't hers. "I'm here to see Harry." "Is he here or not?" Daphne asked, getting more perturbed. The woman stared at her for several long moments, as if trying to decide what she should do, when a third voice was heard. This one she knew, and it sent a wave of warmth through her body. "Who is it?" The woman and the boy stepped away and Harry came into view. He looked just as wonderful as always, his hair just as messy, and his amazing green eyes sparkling in the sunlight. His face changed from curious to disbelieving as he saw her. Daphne merely smiled warmly at him as he stepped forward. "What are you doing here?" Harry asked. Daphne didn't answer right away. She simply continued to look at him. Then, her smile melted away and her face contorted into a mask of rage. She balled her fist and with all the power she could muster, hit Harry Bloody Potter right in the face. Harry stumbled back, and tripped over the large boy, who was trying to get out of the way. The woman stared in horror at the Daphne's handiwork. "How dare you decide what's best for me without even speaking to me?" Daphne shouted. "I thought Draco Malfoy was an arrogant sod, but you just surpassed him. I mean, the absolute gall of you to dump me, at a funeral, no less, and not even give me a chance to express my feelings on the matter. I mean, my gods, I almost died for you. That's why I..." Harry tried, holding his eye where Daphne had clocked him. "Shut up. You had your say, mister, now it's my turn. If you think for a second you can just walk away from me like that, you have really gone round the twist. I am not some simpering fangirl who you can use and toss away like some cheap floozy. I am in love with you, and I will fight to my dying breath for you. Even if it means fighting you." "Yes, I think you made that clear," Harry said, still holding his now pulsing eye. "You deserved it for what you did to me. Harry, you didn't even come see me in the hospital wing. I knew you were upset over what happened, but how could you think that it would all be better if you simply stayed away? It made things worse." "Excuse me." Daphne turned to see the thin woman looking out the door with a look of utter humiliation on her face. "Perhaps you can bring a conversation, indoors. There's no need to alert the entire neighborhood to your plight." "Plight?" Daphne asked, incredulous. She arched her eyebrow in a curious expression, which the woman didn't bother to notice. "No one else needs to know of your condition," the woman said with pleading eyes. Daphne turned a confused look to Harry, who mirrored her own confusion. The woman waved frantically with her bony hands for Daphne to enter the house, keeping her large eyes on the street behind her. Daphne gave a quick glance over her shoulder as she entered. Harry rose from his spot on the floor, and she followed him into the sitting room, while the thin woman escorted her son into the kitchen, and back to his meal. "What does she mean, my condition?" Daphne asked with cold eyes. "What have you told her?" "I haven't spoken to them at all since I've been home." "We don't get along," Harry said, his tone bitter. "How did you find out where I lived? And how did you get here?" "My father got your address, and I took the night bus here," Daphne replied. "Why did she look so nervous?" Daphne asked, pointing to the kitchen. "My aunt and uncle are very concerned about what the neighbors think of them. They have done all they could to make everyone believe I'm some kind of delinquent." "Oh my gods, she thinks you got me pregnant," Daphne nearly shouted. Her eyes were bulging and her hands shot to her mouth. Harry's eyes opened wide in horrified shock. "But we never..." he began. "She doesn't know that," Daphne pointed out, and then began laughing. Harry could not help himself and began laughing as well. It wasn't very long before the both of them were holding their sides at the absurdity of their situation. Given how Daphne had been screaming at him, not to mention punching him in the face, it seemed a rather likely conclusion to someone who didn't know the full story. They began getting themselves under control, and Daphne began shaking her now pulsing right hand. "That really hurt. I've never punched anyone before," Daphne said, still smiling. Harry looked up at her, his smile fading away to be replaced by the same hard look he'd worn at the funeral. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "I was being serious earlier, Harry," Daphne said, the smile still on her face. I'm not letting you go. Harry's smile faded and he fell onto the sofa. Daphne took a seat in an armchair and watched him. She could tell by his expression that he was struggling to keep his guard up, and she knew that she had to be careful here. One wrong word, and she would truly lose him. You don't understand, he began. Then help me too, Daphne pleaded. This doesn't make sense to me, Harry, and I'm not going to give up what is possibly the best thing in my life without a fight. I thought that this meant something to you as well as me, but your actions tell me different. It does mean something to me, damn it, Harry snapped. Daphne actually leaned away at Harry's retort, and Harry looked remorseful immediately. I'm sorry. You have no idea how much it hurt me to do that. To leave like that, but I have to. If you stay with me, you're going to get killed, and I can't take that. Isn't it my choice how I live my life? Daphne asked. Harry looked up at her, and she softened her gaze. Harry, life without you simply doesn't feel worth living. I'm no safer with you than without you. Voldemort knows I fought at your side, and despite your moronic noble intentions, he'll come after me eventually. It's the same for Hermione, Neville, and Tracy. We stand a far greater chance if we stand united than we do apart. And if it's my destiny to die fighting with you, then so be it. At least I'll know that I truly lived my life, and that I loved you as hard and as fiercely as any one person could love another. Harry shook his head. He could hear his inner voice laughing at him, and it irked him. She made perfect sense. And to make matters worse, he missed her desperately. He looked up at her and his heart leapt into his throat. She looked amazing, even though it was clear she was still angry at him. He knew he deserved her anger, and more. I can't. He began feebly. Damn it, Harry. I will cast a permanent sticking charm to you so you have no choice. I'm not letting this go. I love you. I love you, too. Harry admitted, his eyes filling with tears. I'm so sorry for what I did. Daphne came to his side, and wrapped her arms around him. I told you at the funeral that I understood. I know that you're hurting, Harry, and that you just want us all safe. We want the very same for you. Stop fighting all of us. Stop fighting me, and just let me help you. Let us help you. Harry allowed himself to be engulfed in Daphne's embrace. As soon as her arms were around him, the dam that he'd unknowingly been building, broke away. All of the pain of losing Ron, of avoiding his friends came crashing down on him. He felt so much anger at the people who were truly responsible for Ron's death. Two men in particular. Voldemort, and Dumbledore. Dumbledore, at least, was trying to make amends. I'm sorry, Daphne. Harry whispered as he got himself under control. It was just too much, and I couldn't deal with it. Daphne pulled his chin up so she could look into his eyes. You should have confided in me. There is nothing that we can't get through. But I can't do anything if you keep everything bottled up. You have to learn to trust in me, like I trust in you. Got it? Harry had to smile at Daphne's tone. It was like she were talking to a 5-year-old, which admittedly, he had been acting like. Now, are you going to kiss me or what? She smiled, and Harry's heart pounded in his chest. Of course, he'd been an idiot to even think of leaving this girl, who'd proven to be not only beautiful but intelligent and powerful. Harry realized that he'd always done better with the help of his friends. Without Hermione and Ron's help, Harry would never have done the things he'd done. And if Neville, Tracy, and Daphne hadn't come along with the rest of them, Harry most assuredly not be sitting here with the girl he loved so deeply now. He bent forward and captured her lips. She tasted just as sweet as she always did, and Harry cursed himself for nearly giving her up. He had been stupid, and he knew it, but he didn't want to watch her die. But she was right. It was her choice. He would just have to find another way to protect her. All of them. He realized now that Daphne wasn't the only one who he would lose the same argument to, especially if Hermione's letters were anything to go on. As Daphne didn't need to leave for home right away, the two teens spent the afternoon together. Harry took his girlfriend out to the park where he had spent much of his youth in order to get away from the Dursleys. It was strange to Harry. He had never imagined he would ever be walking down Privet Drive with such a lovely girl. She held his hand the entire time, and looked about curiously as they walked. Many of the neighbors who Harry and Daphne gave strange looks at Harry. He guessed they were possibly wondering how such an obvious troubled youth wound up with a very upstanding-looking young woman. "Why does everyone stare at you here?" Daphne asked. "I mean, I know they don't know you're famous, or anything like that, but it's like they're all waiting for you to do something. You remember what I told you at my house? They all think I'm some kind of criminal. They've told everyone I go to some school for the criminally insane, or something. Plus, I'm always wearing this crap, because I've never had clothes of my own. So it all kind of perpetuates the story." Daphne turned astonished eyes on Harry, who'd suddenly gone red in the face. "You've never had your own clothes?" It was clear to her now that Harry was embarrassed by his admission, but he nodded confirmation. "That's horrid. No one should be made to live like that, Harry." "It wasn't the worst of it, but I don't want to talk about it anymore," Harry said, and Daphne respected his wish. Internally, however, she was wondering what else her boyfriend had suffered through during his youth. At 6:30, Harry and Daphne returned to Harry's house, and as soon as they entered the door, Aunt Petunia was on them. "Oh, wonderful, you're still here. Would you care to join us for dinner?" Daphne looked to Harry, who gave her a meaningful look. He had explained earlier how his relatives had flipped the personalities over the past 2 weeks in a desperate hope they might benefit from the knowledge that Harry was more than a bit wealthy. "Actually, I'd be delighted," Daphne said politely. She wanted to see more of this farce for some inexplicable reason. Maybe it was the Slytherin in her, but she just had to observe these people who had treated Harry so terribly over the years. "Wonderful." Petunia clapped her hands and led them to the dining room, where both Uncle Vernon and Dudley sat. "Ah, Harry, boy, who are you, lad? And who is this enchanting young lady?" Vernon said in his most polite and charming voice. This is Daphne Greengrass, my girlfriend. She goes to my school." Daphne almost missed it. The flash of fright in the extremely beefy man's beady little eyes. His hand came up as Harry introduced her, and hesitated just a fraction of a second before Vernon extended it fully. He shook her hand quickly, and then it disappeared under the table, where Daphne was sure he was wiping it off on his trousers. Harry helped Daphne into a seat before taking one of his own. Uncle Vernon looked as if he was about to ask another question when the doorbell rang. "Dudley, go see who's at the door, Popkin," Aunt Petunia said with a smile. Dudley huffed as he got up from his chair and left them. "How long have you two been dating?" Aunt Petunia gave a false sweet smile as she set a bowl on the table before her husband. "Harry is so terrible about telling us what goes on in his life." "Nearly a year now." Daphne smiled politely. She was beginning to enjoy watching Harry's relatives. She wondered how nervous they might be with two magical people at their table. It was clear they were putting on a show for her benefit, possibly trying to convince her that they were the bar by which all others should be measured. It was too bad that Harry had forewarned her. Dudley said as he re-entered the dining room. His chubby face had gone quite pale. "It's for Harry." Both Harry and Daphne stood up and made their way out to the entry hall. Daphne felt in her back pocket for her wand, just to make sure it was there. Relief washed over her as she saw who the guest was. "It is good to see you again, Harry." Albus Dumbledore smiled genuinely as he greeted Harry with a kind handshake. Neither Harry nor Daphne could truly believe what they were seeing. Dumbledore was wearing a stylish Muggle silk suit in a fine magenta. He even had a matching fedora. "And Miss Greengrass, this is indeed a surprise. It was my intention to collect you this evening, just as soon as I had retrieved Mr. Potter." "What?" Harry asked. Daphne looked as confused as Harry sounded. "Yes. You see, I have been making plans for your summer, which I hope you will find, not only informative, but enjoyable as well. I've much to make up for. There have also been some other, let's call them, issues. We shall speak of those a bit later, however." Dumbledore smiled. "Well, we do still need to visit the Greengrass family, so if you'd be so kind to gather your things." Harry turned and began making his way up the stairs, with Daphne on his heels. "But, they've not eaten," Petunia said from the doorway. "Mrs. Dursley, do you honestly believe that one dinner will make up for 15 years of abuse? As I told you both when I returned with Harry at the beginning of the holiday, you should have shown him every kindness from the day you took him in. Now it is all too late. Your things, Harry," Dumbledore encouraged. Harry burst into his room and with Daphne's help, picked up his trunk and returned down the stairs. "Where do you think he's taking us?" Daphne asked. "With Dumbledore, anything is possible," Harry said, unable to contain his excitement of finally leaving the Dursleys forever. "Set them on the floor. If you would free your owl, Harry, and hand her to me." Dumbledore smiled, offering his arm. Harry unlatched Hedwig's cage, and helped the snowy owl out and onto Dumbledore's arm. Dumbledore brought the owl close and whispered something to her. Hedwig gave a soft hoot, leapt onto Harry's shoulder, where she rubbed her head against his, and then took flight, sailing out of the open back door. Dumbledore then gave a flick of his wand, and shrunk Harry's belongings. "They shall be quite safe in your pocket now, I believe," Dumbledore said, and Harry bent and picked up his trunk and Hedwig's cage, which looked like they'd be quite nice in a dollhouse. "Well now, I think it best if we got underway." He gave quick nod of his head to the Dursleys, who were now all standing in the small hallway watching Harry preparing to leave. Harry turned to his relatives. He had often thought of what he might say to them on the day he would finally be free of them, but now that the moment was here, words escaped him. "Well," Uncle Vernon said gruffly, and Harry was suddenly glad that the man he'd known all his life was back. "Do try not to darken our doorway again." "I think you can count on that," Harry said. "You people are disgusting," Daphne suddenly said, unable to hold her tongue. "I don't know if there is a hell, but if there is, you people have places reserved in the most awful part." "Come on," Harry said, taking Daphne by the arm. "Goodbye," he said over his shoulder. "I should have hexed them." Daphne sulked as Harry led her to the sidewalk, where Dumbledore was waiting patiently. "They aren't worth the effort," Harry said. "Indeed," Dumbledore agreed, not looking at them. He seemed to be scanning the street. At once he began walking, with Harry and Daphne right on his heel. "Sir, where are we going?" Harry asked. "All in good time, Harry. It is best not to speak of such things while in the open. Do not worry though. All will be revealed to you both soon." "Ah, this way." Harry recognized the same path he had faced Dementors the year before. Dumbledore stopped just as soon as they were out of sight and held up both of his arms. "If you two will kindly take hold, we shall be on our way," he said, still keeping his eyes scanning their surroundings. Harry looked at Daphne, who shrugged, and together they moved forward, each taking one of the headmaster's arms. "This might be a bit uncomfortable." Dumbledore chuckled. "Please like and subscribe."